Hey, this is Jennifer Mathis from Ellison Lane. So today we're going to talk a little bit about foundation paper piecing. It's one of my very most favorite ways to make a quilt block. It takes out all of the guesswork. The first thing you're going to need is some fabric. It's a great way to fussy cut, so if you have a special piece of fabric you've been saving for just the right project, this is the one. It's also perfect for scraps. This is a piece of fabric left over from another project. It'll be perfect for what we're working on today. You need a glue stick, a rotary cutter, paper scissors, and a ruler. Now I like to use an add-a-quarter ruler. It has an extra lip on the edge that helps you with your seam allowance. It'll make more sense when we get started. You also need thread. Now you can paper piece with any thread, but you want it to be fine and thin and strong. Coats & Clark has a brand new thread called paper piecing, and I highly recommend it. It's fine, it's strong, it's thin. It does everything you need with paper piecing. The last thing you need is a pattern. Now, patterns come with numbers, and if you can count, you can paper piece. So let's get started. Let's start with our beginning paper piecing pattern. We're going to be working on a diamond and a square. And it's important to remember when you're paper piecing and you cut out your pattern piece with your paper scissors, don't even think about picking up those fabric scissors, to leave yourself a seam allowance around the edge. If I were making this pattern, which has 3 sections, I would be sure to cut along this dashed line, leaving a seam allowance for each section. And then you just work like any other paper piece pattern according to the numbers. You start with number 1, then you sew number 2, and then number 3. It's just like paint by numbers. You can do this. So let's start. I am going to start on this pattern, place it face down, take a dab of glue stick, a little tiny bit in the middle on the number 1. You're going to take your fabric that you are going to make your main focal point. And so in this regard, I'm going to fussy cut that diamond shape. And to do that, if you need to hold it up to a light if you're sewing in the evening, or if you're sewing at day, hold it up to a window. You need to be able to see through your paper and to see where your fabric placement will be. And that's why you put a little dab of glue stick on the back of your pattern so that your fabric will stick. So now that you have your fabric lined up on your focal point and it's held together by a dab of glue stick, if it starts to slip, add a stick more. What you need to do is trim your fabric after you fold your pattern between the 1 and the 2. Trim it so you have a 1/4 inch seam allowance here. That is where your add-a-quarter ruler is your best friend. You can use a regular ruler here, but this add-a-quarter ruler has the little ledge here that backs up to your pattern, and it takes all the guesswork out of it. Now, you want a piece of fabric that is big enough to cover this triangle space when you sew and flip it over, including the seam allowance. So, place your piece of fabric. I am using a generous piece of fabric. Fold your pattern over flat. You're going to sew across this bold line from here to here, and do not sew into the seam allowance. You need to shorten your stitch length on your machine. I shortened mine to a 1.5. You could do that or a 1.0. Anything smaller and it's impossible to pick out those stitches if you need to. It's important that you keep your fabric's right sides together on the underneath side of your pattern. So along the bold line, it's just like coloring in the lines. Each time opening up your fabric and going over to your ironing board to give it a good press. Now, for the sake of our video and our instructions here, I am not going to press. Don't tell the quilting police, but I am going to finger press instead. I'm going to trim my seam allowance, keeping my 1/4 inch, trimming all this excess fabric along the way. Save those big scraps. Those would be great for a scrappy quilt. And making sure I have enough fabric to cover my corner piece. I am going to sew once again on the line. This is kind of like paint by numbers. If you can sew along the line, you don't even have to be able to color in the lines. You just have to be able to sew along the line. You can see where our fussy cut is taking shape here. We have one more section to go. So now down to section 5. Again, I would have pressed that fabric if I was making time to do that, which I definitely suggest. It's not that big of a deal on this small piece, but if you have a piece that has lots of small parts, it really will make a difference in your final outcome. And you don't want wrinkles in your fabric when you're all finished. So line up your edges, keeping that 1/4 inch seam. Fold your pattern, sew along the line. Making sure each time when you are sewing that your fabrics are right sides together. I can't tell you how many times I have sewn and opened up to flip my fabric and find that I have sewn the fabric on the wrong side. So keep that in mind every time. Now, your finished product will look something like this. And all you need to do is trim up the excess, give it a good press, and then you are going to trim with your rotary cutter on this dashed line. Okay, so once you have sewn all of your lines and you have pressed your fabric, you now need to trim, giving yourself a seam allowance on all sides. So just trim right through the paper on the dashed line. That's why it's there. Work your way around. Like I say, there is some fabric waste in paper piecing, but the better you get at judging how much fabric to use to cover your sections, the less you'll stress about it. I used a generous amount of fabric today to show you an example. This is what the back of your pattern should look like when you are all finished, and this is the front. Now on my block here, I have centered my fussy cut on an angle, and these are actually supposed to be upside down. They're Christmas clothes on a line. So there you go. So I hope you enjoyed today's lesson on beginner paper piecing. It really is one of my absolute most favorite ways to quilt. And you can take that little block and do so much with it. You can make a mug rug, a pillow, a quilt. An entire quilt out of this pattern would be absolutely fabulous. So we'll come back another time to do a more intricate paper piecing block. But until then, have fun with it. Thanks again for stopping by.